My name is Father George Williams. I am the Catholic chaplain at San Quentin State Prison in California. We've got 4,000 prisoners there, and of them, 730 of them are men on California's death row. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with men on death row. This first part of our presentation, we have two fellow presenters. One is Dr. Ron Garret, sitting right here, who spent 22 years or 20 years in the Georgia prison, but while there, as an inmate, while he was there, he was able to get both a master's degree and a doctorate degree, and he's working now in reentry, specifically the reentry coordinator, Welcome Home Reentry Program in DC, which is a division of Catholic Charities, and he was going to talk about reentry and his experience prior to that, and also Father Dustin Feddon is in Tallahassee, Pensacola, Florida. He is also a death row prison chaplain there and runs a newly opened reentry house called Joseph House. And so he also will be contributing his experience. We'll also have plenty of time for questions. I want to introduce one of my closest friends, Father Jim Martin, who will be speaking later tonight. But Jim worked with me in Boston years ago when he was in theology at the Suffolk County House of Correction. So he also has experience working in prison. But thanks for being with us, Jim. So I'd like to start with sharing a passage from Luke's Gospel, chapter 28. One of the criminals hanging there reviled Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other, however, rebuking him, said in reply, "Have you no fear of God? For you are subject to the same condemnation. We have been condemned justly, for the sentence we received corresponds to our crimes. But this man has done nothing criminal." Then he said to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Amen, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." In February 1987, Dennis Webb, who was a drifter from North Texas, who had spent the last 20 years of his life in and out of prison, needed money for his cocaine habit, so he decided to rob some people. He broke into the apartment of John and Lori Rainwater, a young Christian couple who had two young children, one a newborn, only a few weeks old, another a 2-year-old girl. He broke into their apartment, pistol whipped the couple, tied them up, and over the course of the next 8 hours, brutalized them, raped both of them. The police found blood all over the apartment. At one point during the night, he must have passed out, and John and Lori were able to escape from their bonds and ran out into the parking lot of their apartment to get help carrying their babies. Dennis woke up, ran after them, and murdered both of them in the parking lot, killing them execution style with a shot to the back of the head. The police found the babies alive and under their parents' bodies, trying to protect them. Dennis, a year and a half later, Dennis was sentenced to death in California. And it was said at his trial, when the verdict was read, he laughed. I met Dennis 25 years later, when he was living in cell 68 on California's death row. He was now 60 years old, but he looked 90. He was very, very sick, chronic illnesses, a broken man. He had converted to Catholicism somewhere along his journey, most of which had been spent in solitary confinement the first part of his time on death row. He found his way to Catholicism through the Eucharist and through St. Dismas. St. Dismas was the name the tradition gives to the good thief who I quoted in that reading. And he felt a very close connection to Dismas, which I think was very apt. And I would visit him, every time I visited him, he would insist that I bring him communion, and I had to give it to him. The only way to give him communion was through a little slot at the very top of his cell because it was covered with a heavy metal mesh. Dennis had shared to me his devotion to St. Dismas, and he really became a living, almost an incarnation of Dismas to me. At the trial, he said to the jury, I quote, "I have no feelings, ladies and gentlemen. I've got no heart. My heart is like a block of ice. Death is the only appropriate sentence for me. unaware at the time, he was really paraphrasing Dismas, who said, "Indeed, we have been condemned justly, for the sentence we receive corresponds to our crimes." A few months before he died, he said to me one time, we were having a conversation, he said, "Father, I've lived a bad life." And he just said it with such sadness. I remember just tears came to my eyes. And then he gave me the little image of Dismas that he was wearing, which I still wear. It's somewhere here. So anyway, this was Dennis's, and you can see it. Anyway, it's here. So anyway, there it is. It's the image of the good thief. So the Dennis I had come to know was no longer this cold-blooded murderer who had taken the lives of the Rainwaters years before. And yet he had never changed his opinion that what he had done merited the death penalty and he was deserving what he got. Now what happened was, because he was so ill, he was constantly in pain, and he asked me in October of 2016 if I would pray that God would take him home. He just had enough. And so I said, sure, I'll pray that God takes you home, if that's what you're ready for. And it reminded me of, again, what Dismas said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He had pneumonia. It took the doctor a month to actually get around to checking his lungs. And by that point, it was too late. He ended up in the hospital. I was able to anoint him, and he passed away December 17th in a state of grace. And Jesus said, "Amen, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Why do I share that story? Well, to me, it's emblematic of what we're all about in this work. It's about hope and the power of the resurrection in the midst of crushing darkness, crushing indifference to the human spirit, just cruelty on a scale that's hard for any of us to imagine. God is love, and in the end, love is all that matters. And Dennis, to me, represents how the human spirit can experience reconciliation, healing, and hope, even in the midst of what seems hopeless. I mean, he knew he would never get out of prison. He knew he would die in prison. And yet, he died in grace. And that's what we're here to represent for all of you, to invite you to, in your studies, to learn more about the death penalty system, about the mass incarceration system, to become informed, and then at some point become more involved personally. But the most important thing you can do at this point is to become more informed. So, because our call to prison ministry is a call to respond to human suffering on a scale that most of us really can't imagine. It's obvious that Jesus' death on the cross did not stop human suffering, but what it does represent is hope over that suffering. That in the end, suffering and the death penalty and death does not have the final word. Goodness, justice, and mercy will overcome all the evil in the world. That's what the resurrection promises us. Hebrews 3:13 has a statement that says, "Be mindful of prisoners as if sharing their imprisonment, and of the ill-treated as of yourselves." So we are called as Christians not just to think about them, but to think about them as ourselves, that we are also in prison with them. We're all prisoners in a sense. We're prisoners of our own ignorance, we're prisoners of racism, we're prisoners of indifference, and so we share, in a sense, the lack of freedom that people incarcerated have. Plus, if you live to be long enough, we're all going to lose our freedom, the freedom of our body, our freedom of movement, the things that happen with age. So it's important that we realize that these men and women in prison are no different from ourselves. And any of us could end up in a situation like they do. Even not necessarily mean that I would never do a crime as horrible as that. Who knows? You know, there's any number of ways that we can end up messing our lives up. So I just want to bring that up, is the fact that we're all called to this work by Christ. In fact, we're commanded to it in Matthew 25. You know, we're going to be judged at the end on Judgment Day, not on how well we followed doctrine, not on how often we went to church or not, but how often did we care for the hungry, the homeless, the sick, and visit people in prison and in hospitals. So I'd like to, having said that as sort of introduction, then I'd like to invite Dr. Garret to give us his story about his journey and what it was like for him to be actually a person who was incarcerated. And despite being in a place like Georgia, accomplished so much in his life. He's just a real example of the kind of hope that we're trying to convey today.
You all help me, because I'm also a preacher. When they give me a microphone, I tend to get long-winded. Somebody at about 10 minutes, somebody do me like that. Y'all gonna help me? Okay. First of all, I would just like to say I'm honored to be here with you. I don't know exactly what was your reason for signing up for this session, but if it is to bring some healing in the area of criminal justice and social justice in this country, I applaud every one of you. Again, my name is Ron Garret. In 1998, I began a missionary journey in the Georgia Department of Correction that lasted 20 years of my life. I grew up in households, many like yours. My father's a United Methodist pastor. My mother's an educator. I believe it was a little bit too strict on us growing up. But when I went to college to become an electrical engineer at 17 years old, and given the whole big wide world and all of the new decisions that I can now make on my own, I was a little bit overwhelmed in that process. Started experimenting with drinking, drugs. It took about 8 years for me to develop an addiction to alcohol and cocaine. I spent about 12 years of my life after I flunked out of school. I got to put that part in. Roaming the streets, living actually homeless at times because of my addiction. Again, in 1998, I began a 20-year sentence in the Georgia Department of Corrections that just ended September the 4th of 2018. During my opportunity to go to a place like the Georgia Department of Corrections, what was the key word I said in that sentence? My opportunity, because it saved my life. It literally saved my life. I can remember praying to God to please help me, to rescue me from this cycle that I was in, that I did not have the power within myself to break. And shortly, a couple of days later, he dispatched a legion of angels. They came with blue lights. They had stars on their chest and matching uniforms. And I was like, wow, you did all of this for me. But in fact, he did it because he loved me, right? I was able to be delivered from my addiction to alcohol and drugs in the Department of Corrections, not because I was in the Department of Corrections. Many of you may not know that some of the best drugs and the best alcohol there is made, it is available inside of prisons and jails, believe it or not. But because I had a desire in my heart to do God's will and to serve His purpose and to find out and fulfill the destiny that He created me to fulfill. By the grace of God, I was delivered. I started attending a Bible study on the 3rd week I was in the county jail. And I will never forget, Reverend Peters started an expository study of the book of Luke. And it changed my entire life. I've never looked back since. The thing that struck me the most when I got to the Georgia Department of Corrections from the county jail was the fact that there was no programming. All we did was got up every morning, go eat breakfast, come back to your dorm, and you just sit there all day. They actually had an activity called the Wellness Walk, where we went outside and just walked around the field, the exercise yard, for 3 or 4 hours so that the warden and everybody could go in and inspect the dormitories and make sure that it was clean and everything. And then they would bring us back in for lunch, eat lunch, and then sit there with no programming, no education classes, no computer classes, no parenting classes, and it blew my mind that this is what was taking place on the inside of a prison. Well, we began to, I read an article, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Prison Fellowship Ministries. I read an article called in the Inside Journal that was referencing a new dorm that they had opened in the Texas prison system called the Vance Unit. It was a faith-based re-entry dorm program. And all of the other men that read the same article that I did, their hope was, man, I wish we were at that jail, or I wish we were in that prison system and we could be getting that kind of help. Well, that's not kind of the way my mind works. I said, well, you know, what about, let's see why we can't bring that program to Georgia. So it took about 6 years of prayer, whining, complaining, writing letters to everybody you can imagine, all the way to the governor. To, you know, why are we just sitting here, people who want to be rehabilitated, but we have no access to any kind of classes or anything to do that. And finally, I got a visit from the administration of the prison I was housed. Please stop writing the warden. Please don't write the governor anymore. We're going to give you all a dorm. We're going to put you all in there, come up with some classes. The first fight that we have is over. Well, we never had a fight because the guys were so excited about having the opportunity to teach ourselves. We didn't have volunteers coming in to teach the classes because, believe it or not, in prison, there are people who are accountants, math teachers, English teachers. So we marshaled the resources that were available to us already in the system, and we taught ourselves. Does that make sense? Today, there are 16 different prisons in the state of Georgia that have what is called a faith-based reentry dormitory program. In 2011, they gave us a 400-bed prison that they were going to close, and it has now been refurbished and repurposed to be called Walker Faith and Character-Based Reentry Prison. It's a 2-year reentry program. Has a less than 2% recidivist rate. And guess how much it costs the state of Georgia? $0. We had to write the curriculums. Only that they let us use the copy and gave us copy paper, right? But now there are many ministries from the outside that have come in to help us with resources and to help us with classes and whatnot. The best way I can describe Walker to you is that it is a community college inside of a prison. Our community college just happen to have a fence around it, so that was a big difference. Re-entry programming, which takes place on the inside of jails and prison prior to returning citizens being released, right? Reintegration, the programming that takes place in society when returning citizens come home. You can't have one or the other and expect for the system to work. There has to be preparation on the inside, but there also has to be churches and other faith-based organizations, employment opportunities on the outside to give returning citizens a chance when they do come home. Does that make sense? The top 3 predicting factors of the success of a returning citizen: good family, solid family support, stable housing, and employment. When any one of those 3 things are missing, there's a 75% likelihood that individual is going to go back to prison. Now, by the grace of God, I facilitate a program called the Welcome Home Reentry Mentoring Program for the District of Columbia, where we match mentors in the community with returning citizens that are coming home. Because as a returning citizen that doesn't have family support, that doesn't have that brother to take them through the process and show them how to ride the metro, where to go and get your driver's license. I actually had a phone call from a gentleman that did 42 years in prison. The Federal Bureau of Prisons dropped him off in the District of Columbia at a shelter. And they told him that you have a bed there, just tell the people who you are, they know you're coming. They didn't know who he was. I had a phone call at 11:30 at night. I always answer my phone because I figure if somebody's calling at that time of night, it's probably an emergency. This poor gentleman, after spending 42 years in prison, he had spent the last hour, it'll blow your mind when he was done, walking around the city, up and down the streets, looking for a payphone. Any of you that are have a passion for reducing mass incarceration and being a servant in the area of social justice, I applaud you, because there are people who are going to need your smiling face and your caring heart of compassion on the other side of the desk when they come to you in need of services to help get their life back on course. I really appreciate your time. I hope I didn't go too long, but this work is very important, and I can't think of a better work for the kingdom of God to be involved in than reducing mass incarceration and increasing the likelihood that when a returning citizen comes home, that they're able to become contributors to society, right? Assets. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, Dustin, would you like to share your work with us?
All right. Well, sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I appreciate both George's comments and Eric's as well. The work of reentry I'm finding to be, as Eric mentioned, a wonderful opportunity to get involved in works of social justice. My name is Dustin. I'm a priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, where we have in our diocese, really between Pensacola and Tallahassee, which is kind of the Panhandle area in North Florida, we have about 40,000 incarcerated in my diocese alone. And so this is kind of, I consider it almost kind of an epicenter here of mass incarceration. And I've been involved in prison ministry for about 6 years since I started as I was a seminarian when I first started about 6 years ago. And I was kind of thrown into the deep end in terms of prison ministry because my first exposure was death row ministry and in solitary confinement as well. And there's in this ministry what I kind of realized pretty early on is that what we are exposed to in prison ministry and pastoral ministry in prisons are issues of grave societal ills, of grave social injustices. And there's one encounter that for me kind of really brought this home or perhaps kind of really revealed it to me. And that was when I was at Union Correctional here in Florida, in Rayford, Florida. I was on my way to go visit those on death row. And as I was walking to the P dorm, I was walking by a lot of these cages that kind of look more like dog cages, kennel cages. Although what you might imagine were, would be cages where you would cage animals, there were human beings in these cages. And so there were all of these men kind of walking, just kind of pacing back and forth about 7 or 8 feet. And that was where they got their kind of quote unquote yard time. That was their opportunity to go out in the yard, but in cages. And as I was walking by these cages, this one young man called out to me and said, "Hey, Dustin." And I looked over at him and I immediately realized that this is a gentleman that I had encountered about a week prior to that in the solitary confinement cells. And fortunately, I'm usually pretty bad with names, but at this moment, I actually remembered his name. And so I called out to him. I said, hey, Michael, how are you? And I'll never forget the look on Michael's face as his jaw just dropped and he called out and said to me, "You remembered my name." And in that moment, I think I finally kind of got the extent to which prisons can be so dehumanizing that people can lose a sense of their identity, a sense of their own name, and a sense of belonging. And in that moment, to me, was kind of brought home to me that prison ministry, yes, it's visiting the imprisoned, but it's also a kind of and I say this kind of carefully, it's a privileged opportunity to be exposed to, again, these kind of grave social injustices where human beings are being caged, being warehoused in ways that are was definitely subhuman, and again, dehumanizing. And over the time in solitary confinement, and going into the prisons in Florida, there's one particular camp that I go to called Santa Rosa, which is kind of closer to Pensacola. And there are about 1,100 men in solitary confinement. And it's just these massive dorms that are more or less like warehousing units where human beings are being warehoused. And in Florida, we have over about 10,000 men that are in solitary confinement at any given moment. And as I kind of walk through these dorms, I realize as you're kind of going through these concrete hallways lined with steel cells and filled with men that are sweltering in the summer heat, and oftentimes, as actually Ron was talking earlier about the kind of catching a bit of a glimpse of the kind of the boredom, the idleness, that to me, oftentimes I feel like that's probably the most oppressive aspect of prison life that I've been able to experience is the degree of boredom and idleness that I've encountered in mass incarceration and in very close proximity. But anyways, as I kind of moving along these hallways and the conversations that I have, I realize not only am I talking with so many that are, many of these men that are in confinement, that are in prison, but as I begin to hear their stories and where they come from and their life experiences, I realize that I'm talking to really the poorest of the poor. I'm talking to about 75% of the men that I visit have reading level of about a fifth grader or sixth grader. And I would say the vast majority of these men in confinement are under the age of 40. And I would also say that the vast majority of faces that I see are Black faces in these cells. And so in making these visits, it is an opportunity, I think, for the church, for us in prison ministry, again, to witness the injustices. But you know, as Ron mentioned, and you know, and as George talked about, it is our mission as a church to bring hope. And to me, I see so much of the pastoral ministry summed up by what we hear in the Second Vatican Council documents, talking about the mission of the church is to restore that innermost nature of the human person's nature as a social being. And that is to say, to bring a sense of connection, a sense of belonging to the wider human family. For me, that sums up the mission that at least I have experienced in prison ministry and pastoral ministry among the imprisoned. And that is, certainly it is not to proselytize, and I wouldn't even say it's so much strictly speaking to catechize, but rather it is to create opportunities where there's a greater sense of connection, a greater sense of belonging, even if it is in these most inhumane kind of contexts in so many of the prisons that I visit. And yet I've seen kind of up close and personal the extent to which lay people, clergy, and others going out into prisons can kind of reinforce that sense of connection and that sense of belonging, and then just to build from there, build up relationships, and hearing the stories of those that are imprisoned. And so just to close, I would say, again, prison ministry, pastoral ministry in prisons exposes you not only to so many of the societal ills and greater opportunities of bringing social justice into these areas, but it is also a place where there is a vital need to bring a sense of hope and real possibilities of restoration in the relationships that we develop.
Was before entering prison or not, we tend to become, I'm going to use the right word, extroverts, right? Everybody wants to, or introverts, yeah, to myself, right? I got to do the right one. Because nobody wants to trust anybody, Nobody wants to just take the chance of being hurt again. People don't understand how much of the crime that takes place in the community. We've all heard the statement, hurt people do what? Hurt people, and that's where it comes from. So being able to share with them the great need of this type of having some programming available to them, that's the key. Because society doesn't understand what really goes on the inside of these places. They think people are in school, they think people are, playing basketball and just having a great time, but that's not what's happening. Right? And I might admit that I missed your question, didn't I? Say it one more time.
So I was just wondering, like you mentioned, how did, I guess, people react in general inside prison?
I'm sorry, I did miss your question. A key component to our program has 4 phases, four quarter phases. Phase 1 is attitude, phase 2, character, phase 3, relationships, phase 4, re-entry. Prior to coming home, there is a whole year of programming, 8 classes that are mandatory in our program that deal with building strong relationships, building trust with one another, and in that environment, for these faith and character-based dorms, it becomes a family. Because once we realize that my goal and your goal is the same, to go home and be successful, the ability to be able to open up and trust again and give another person opportunity to speak into your life, all of that takes place. And it's crucial to preparing people to come home by teaching them the importance of extending relationships to one another. Because a lot of people, when they go in that environment, the first thing they do is shut down and become introverts. Very good.
This is more of a comment. I've been involved down in Flavana and Usman with Kairos.
Right.
And the women who come out of those places have now, just in the last 2 years, set up a Facebook page.
Right.
And you should see the kind of great, and I mean, they've let some of us on it, and the support for one another, who've experienced what they've experienced is fabulous.
Kairos changed my life.
I believe it.
Kairos.
In God's time.
It is a evangelistic piece,
It is.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I had to,
But not everybody is
Right.
in it. Mm-hmm.
and the thing that I had to get the Kairos community from the outside coming in. Okay, now that we have had this great 4-day weekend, and this group of people have either come to Christ or rededicated their lives to the Lord, their number one question is, now what do I do?
You didn't have a monthly support group?
We had a monthly support group, but what I believe we needed, which is what we instituted at a facility, was, I don't know if you're familiar with Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Church. I know a lot of people have heard Purpose-Driven Life, but Purpose-Driven Church was actually written first. That was his doctoral thesis. And a key component to a healthy church is having a very robust discipleship process. And so that became a key component to connecting discipleship to the Kairos program, so that they had an after. Yes. One more question. Ask a question. Yes.
You mentioned that prison saved your life, and I know from my limited knowledge not all people have that same experience. What do you think contributes to that difference in experience? Do you think it's a mindset or?
Very good question. Believe it or not, a great number of people who find their way to the church in prison, they're not finding their way to the church in prison for the first time. It's because they were raised in the church in the first place, believe it or not. And just like myself. What happened with me was, I finally had to sit down with myself and evaluate everything that I had been told all my life. That there's a God that loves me, a Jesus that died on Calvary's cross to save my sins. And I had to come to the point in my life of saying, in order for me to know this for myself, I'm going to have to do something I've never done before. I'm going to have to pick up this book. I don't have a Bible. And read it for myself. One of my mentors encouraged us, since you have so much time and you're talking about all this time you have on your hands, read your Bible. There was a time in my life where 4 hours a day was spent reading my Bible. And then I said, reading the Bible, that can't be the only step. I have to be willing to apply what I'm reading. That's the only way I'm ever going to really know for myself, not because my grandmother told me or my father told me, but so that I can know for myself. I'm going to have to read it, and I'm going to have to practice it. And then if the results are there, and they were, then there's no reason for me to ever turn away from my faith. Because again, having that opportunity to spend those years in that environment, and be ye transformed, how? By the renewing of your mind, right? Reading my Bible, putting it in here, so that this could be transformed, change my life. I promise. Tomorrow we're going to share with you all, again, I think.
Yeah, what time is that?
I want you all to, yeah.
10:30.
10:50.
We're
10:50.
gonna have a little book available for you all, everybody that comes to the thing tomorrow, that's gonna give you 21 testimonies of I'm not the only one that has had this experience. I've got a book here with 20 other of my peers that had the same experience. So I would like you all to have an opportunity to read, okay?
So please come back tomorrow at
Yes.
10:30.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so do we have any questions for myself or Father Dustin at this point? What's our time frame before the panel?
At 5 minutes.
Oh,
And
5
then we're gonna
minutes.
take a break, and what
Okay.
we're gonna do is we're gonna set up, we have, basically 5, opportunities for you to learn about how you can get involved at this stage in life, and how you can change someone's hearts and minds, and along with being transformed yourself. So we're gonna just take a break, and then we're gonna pull out, and we're gonna bring some more speakers up. And so please, I know there's gonna be way more people joining us, but please stay. Just give us a few minutes,
So we have
everybody
about
open
5
up and
minutes.
put some air in it.
Okay, so we have a few more minutes before we do that. So any questions from you or Father Dustin?
I have a question for Father Dustin.
Okay.
What do you think is the biggest barrier that you find between not being incarcerated with yourself and trying to connect with people who are incarcerated?
Dustin?
Sorry, George. Yeah, would you repeat the question?
What do you find is the biggest barrier for you as someone not incarcerated, connecting with the people who are incarcerated?
Biggest barrier. Well, other than the fact that obviously I leave prison, so that's the thing that I can share with you. When I go to the prisons, there's some things that I see, but there's a lot of things I don't see. And I know that's true based upon the stories that they've told me. But I think what is interesting is just again, you take a kind of a relationship approach, a conversation, visiting, or at least I do, in visiting the incarcerated, you come to find out that there's a lot that you do actually share in common. And it's those ordinary conversations that, to me, are the hallmark of prison ministries.
That's a good question. Any other questions? Yeah, Jim?
What's the biggest opposition you find to your work in the Catholic Church from other Catholics?
I think it's fear-based. I think a lot of people are just, we've been conditioned as a culture to be afraid of the other. And people in prison are definitely the other. There is sort of underneath the surface of all of this, there's sort of there's a racism, institutionalized racism in the culture that otherizes people who are not from the dominant culture. And so I think there's just a lot of people in the Catholic community, we know what the scripture says and we know what we're supposed to do, but they're others. So they're the undeserving people. There's many, I often get, this is Catholic CEOs will say to me, well, why do you waste your time with these dirtbags? Why do you go like work in a nursing home or a hospital where the deserving people are? And that's, I guess that's the question is, we don't limit our love to people who deserve it. What does that mean? All of us are brothers and sisters. And I think to your question too about, there is obviously, I walk in there as a white, highly educated male, and who had many things in his life that, especially primarily hope and belief that there were things I could do. And a lot of the men that I've encountered in prison never had that opportunity. They never had the experience of being told that they were worth something, that they could dream something, that could have something. But so I think once you get there and you just start talking to people, as Father Dustin said, we're human, and you connect at that level of just common humanity. And one of my favorite prisoners on death row is an elderly serial killer. And every time I see him when I'm leaving his cell, he says, "Now don't do anything I wouldn't do, Father." And it's like, okay, you set the bar really low, but there's sort of, there's sort of this kind of a dark humor in that, but we're connecting. Even somebody is, thinking, oh my God, a serial killer. He's still a beloved child of God, and he's my brother in Christ. And so I think that's where we are able to overcome some of the initial barriers. But people aren't going to trust you when you walk in there, especially if you don't look like them or if you speak differently. You have to be real. And prisoners are really good at finding out what's real or not. So if you go in there as a genuine person with an open heart, they're going to pick that up. Any other questions? One more before we, yeah.
How do you approach those who aren't necessarily as willing to seek out God?
Well, as Catholic chaplain at San Quentin, my philosophy is I go in there as Catholic means universal. And so I'm not just there for Catholics or Christians. I'm actually in charge of also the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Rastafarians, the Odinists, the Wiccans. And so I try to meet them where they are spiritually. And so if they're not interested in religion, then we talk about something else. In fact, Dennis, the man I spoke about, was very hostile at first to religion, and the way to his heart was Zane Grey novels, Westerns. And after a long period of time of just reading the novels and talking about that or sports, he started being interested a little more in faith things. So, you don't go in there with a heavy, hitting them with the head with the Bible. You go in there, just kind of meet them where they are. St. Ignatian said, go in their door and lead them out yours. And that's kind of the idea, is we want to lead them out into a door of hope. Not necessarily Catholic, but it's nice when it's Catholic. Okay. One last question before we finish? And I'm not finished, but move to our panel. How about for Dustin? Thank you, Dustin, for being with us.